12-year-old Ethan stood trembling in the courtroom. "My father is innocent!" he shouted, slamming a file of evidence onto the judge's desk. Judge Blackwell's face paled as the prosecutor's eyes widened. "You took a bribe, and now everyone will know it." But what happened next, no one saw coming. Ethan Miller was 12 when his world collapsed. His father, Daniel Miller, had been the kind of man everyone in Fairview looked up to, a high school teacher known for his patience and wisdom, the first to volunteer at local events, the man everyone trusted with their kids. He coached the Little League team, ran the annual charity drive, and never missed a Sunday at church. People smiled when they saw him on the street. They invited him to barbecues, waved at him from their porches. He was that guy, the one people believed in. That belief shattered overnight. It started with a whisper, a quiet rumor that slithered through the town like smoke. Money was missing from the Fairview Charity Fund, $50,000, gone without a trace. Daniel was the treasurer. His name was on the documents. His fingerprints were on the papers. Within hours, the quiet rumor became a storm. The sheriff showed up at their door with a warrant, and Ethan watched, frozen, as his father was led away in handcuffs. Daniel didn't fight. He didn't resist. He kissed Ethan's mother on the forehead and told her everything would be fine. "It's a mistake," he said. "It'll all be sorted out." It wasn't. Ethan sat in the back of the packed courtroom 3 days later. His mother, Claire, sat stiffly beside him, her hand gripping Ethan's so tightly it hurt. The air was stale with heat and sweat. Judge Warren Blackwell sat high above the courtroom, tall and skeletal, his face like stone beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. His eyes were dark, cold pools of nothing. When he spoke, his voice was a low growl that vibrated through the wooden benches. "Daniel Miller, you are accused of embezzling $50,000 from the Fairview Charity Fund. How do you plead?" Daniel stood, his hands shaking at his sides. His eyes were wide with disbelief. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Judge Blackwell's expression didn't shift. His mouth curled into a thin, lifeless line. "The evidence is overwhelming," he said. "The funds were traced to your account. Your fingerprints were found on the documents." Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. He wanted to scream, to stand up and tell everyone that it wasn't true. His father would never do something like that. But no one would listen. He could feel it. The weight of the town's judgment pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. People were already whispering. He could see the hard stares from the crowd, the slight tilt of heads as people leaned toward each other to exchange quiet, cutting remarks. Shameful. Who would have thought? I never trusted him. Ethan's gaze shot toward the prosecution table. Mr. Gardner, the town's lead prosecutor, sat with his legs crossed, his tie perfectly knotted. He barely looked at Daniel. He didn't need to. It was obvious he thought this case was already won. "This was a calculated betrayal," Gardner said, standing with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. "Daniel Miller abused his position of trust for personal gain. The people of Fairview deserve justice." Daniel's lawyer stood, a pale, sweaty man who stammered through his opening remarks. He pointed out that Daniel had no prior record, that he had volunteered for the charity for years, that it was absurd to think he'd suddenly steal that amount of money. But his voice lacked conviction, and Judge Blackwell's face remained a stone wall. Ethan's throat burned. He could see his father struggling to stay calm, his eyes shifting toward Claire and Ethan in the crowd. A small, apologetic smile touched his lips, but Ethan could see the truth beneath it. His father knew exactly where this was heading. The trial lasted 2 days. The evidence mounted. Wire transfers traced back to Daniel's account. A signed document, with his fingerprints, authorizing the transfer. suspicious cash withdrawals from an ATM near the charity office. Daniel denied it all, but the evidence was airtight. Every time Daniel protested, Judge Blackwell cut him off with cold efficiency. By the second day, people stopped whispering. They didn't need to. Their minds were made up. The jury returned a guilty verdict in less than an hour. Claire's breath hitched when the judge pronounced the sentence: 5 years in state prison. Daniel's face paled. He didn't even look at the crowd. His gaze remained on Ethan, searching his son's eyes as though trying to tell him it's okay, even as his world collapsed. When the guards came forward to take Daniel away, Ethan couldn't stop himself. He shoved through the crowd, arms shaking, tears burning down his cheeks. "No!" he screamed. "He didn't do it!" Claire pulled him back, wrapping her arms around him, but Ethan thrashed in her grip. His father was already being led toward the side exit. Daniel turned his head, just for a moment, and his eyes softened. "Take care of your mom," he said quietly. And then he was gone. Ethan stood there, gasping, tears streaking his face as the courtroom emptied out. His classmates were there, kids whose parents had invited Daniel over for dinner just months ago. Now they wouldn't even make eye contact. Mrs. Kennedy, the head of the school board, brushed past Ethan without a word. Mr. Rowley from down the street crossed his arms and shook his head. His best friend, Tyler, met his gaze for a brief second before looking away and walking off. Ethan's heart cracked in his chest. His father was gone, and the town had already erased him. That night, Claire sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of red wine and a shaking hand. Ethan sat across from her, his fists clenched on the table. "They framed him," he whispered. Claire's face was pale and hollow. "We don't know that." "I know it," Ethan insisted. "Dad wouldn't do that. He wouldn't." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. Ethan sat awake long after his mother went to bed, his mind burning. The documents, the fingerprints, none of it made sense. His father wasn't a thief, and yet the evidence was perfect, too perfect. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had set him up. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He could see Judge Blackwell's face in his mind, that cold, calculating expression, the way he had cut off Daniel's protests, the way he had barely acknowledged the defense's arguments. It wasn't just a bad verdict. It was a fixed game. Ethan's hands curled into fists. His father was sitting in a cold prison cell because someone wanted him there. "I swear," Ethan whispered, his breath trembling. "I'll prove he's innocent." Outside the window, the streetlights buzzed under the dark sky. Rain began to fall in thin sheets. Ethan sat alone in the dark, his heart pounding. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to find the truth, and when he did, they would pay. Ethan's hatred toward Judge Blackwell and the system that condemned his father grew with each passing day. It sat in his chest like a heavy stone, suffocating him, pressing into his ribs, making it hard to breathe. Everywhere he went, he felt it. The weight of the town's judgment, the quiet whispers behind his back, the eyes that slid away whenever he entered a room. His classmates no longer talked to him. The teachers avoided him. Even people who had known his father for years, who had shaken his hand, eaten at their table, crossed the street when they saw Ethan coming. He wasn't just Daniel Miller's son anymore. He was the son of a criminal. But Ethan knew better. His father was innocent. The evidence was too perfect, the timeline too clean, the wire transfers, the fingerprints. It all fit together too well, like someone had carefully pieced it together, knowing exactly how it would look in court. Ethan's father had been set up, and if no one else was going to figure out the truth, then Ethan would. He threw himself into the case with a single-minded intensity. After school, while the other kids played football or hung out at the gas station, Ethan sat alone in the back corner of the library, surrounded by stacks of books and old court records. He studied legal procedures and forensic analysis, reading until the words blurred together. He learned how fingerprints were collected, how banking transactions could be manipulated, how criminal cases were built and torn apart. He took notes on court procedures, memorizing the ways defense attorneys could challenge evidence. He even learned how digital signatures could be faked, and how someone could frame another person without leaving a trace. But it wasn't enough. He needed to know why his father had been targeted, why Judge Blackwell had been so eager to crush him, why the town had been so quick to believe it. The answer came when he wasn't looking for it. It was late, past 10 o'clock, when Ethan ducked into the local diner. His mother was working the night shift at the hospital, and he hadn't eaten since lunch. The diner was half empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. He slid into a booth near the back, hoping to go unnoticed. But then he heard them. 2 men sitting at the counter, dark jackets, rough faces. One of them had a low, gravelly voice. The other's voice was sharp and thin, like the edge of a knife. "Blackwell got a nice payout for that Miller conviction," the gravelly-voiced man said, stirring his coffee. Ethan's head shot up. His body stiffened. "Straight from Senator Keaton's fund," the thin-voiced man replied. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His pulse hammered in his ears. He slid lower in the booth, listening. "The senator needed Miller out of the way," the man went on, his voice low. "Miller was blocking the new zoning proposal. Too much influence with the school board. Keaton couldn't push it through unless Miller was gone." Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. His hands curled into fists beneath the table. His father's conviction hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't even been personal. His father was a pawn in a political game, collateral damage so Senator Keaton could build his shiny new development project. Judge Blackwell had taken the money and handed Daniel over like a sacrificial lamb. Ethan was on his feet before he realized it. His vision blurred with rage. His father was sitting in a prison cell because of greed, because of corruption. The man he had looked up to for years, Judge Blackwell, the symbol of order and justice in Fairview, was nothing but a crooked puppet master. He followed the men out of the diner. They walked toward the alley behind the building, hands in their pockets, heads lowered against the cold. Ethan's breath curled in the night air as he stalked after them. "What did you mean by that?" he demanded. The men turned. The gravelly-voiced man frowned. "Kid, you don't want to get involved." Ethan stepped closer, his jaw tight. "Tell me." "Walk away." Ethan's hands were shaking, but he didn't back down. He stood his ground. "Tell me." The thin-voiced man sighed. "Look, kid, it's done. Your dad's out of the picture. The senator got what he wanted. You stirring up trouble isn't going to change that." Ethan's eyes darkened. His voice was sharp, cutting. "He's innocent." "Yeah?" The man smiled faintly. "Tell that to the judge." Ethan's hand shot out, grabbing the man's sleeve. His knuckles turned white from the force of his grip. "Why would Blackwell do it?" "Money," the man said simply. "Keaton needed the zoning proposal to go through. Miller was standing in the way. Blackwell's price was 50 grand. Ethan's breath hitched. "That's it?" His voice shook. "My dad's life. For $50,000? The man's gaze sharpened. "Welcome to the real world, kid." Ethan released the man's sleeve. His breath was ragged, his chest tight. The men turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Ethan stood there, shaking, his fists clenching at his sides. Judge Blackwell had destroyed his father's life for $50,000. Senator Keaton had played along because it was convenient. and the town had let it happen. The anger burned in Ethan's chest, hot and blinding. His father had been condemned like a criminal, locked away and forgotten, while Blackwell and Keaton went on with their lives. Untouched. Unbothered. Not anymore. Ethan turned toward the streetlights, his breath curling in the cold night air. His father had always told him to be respectful, to follow the rules. But the rules had destroyed his family. The system had failed. Ethan wasn't going to let them win. He didn't know how yet. He didn't know where to start. But one thing was certain. Judge Blackwell and Senator Keaton had made a mistake. They thought Daniel Miller was weak. They thought his family would roll over and take it. They were wrong. Ethan's fists tightened at his sides. His breath slowed. His gaze sharpened. He would find the truth. He would expose Blackwell and Keaton for what they were. He would make them pay. And when he was done, when the whole town knew the truth, they would regret the day they ever came for the Millers. Ethan stood in the kitchen, his hands pressed flat against the cold countertop. His mother sat across from him, her face pale and hollow, eyes rimmed with dark shadows. The months since Daniel's sentencing had drained the life from her. Her hair hung loose and tangled over her shoulders, and her eyes, once bright with warmth, were empty. She was holding a mug of tea, but her hands were shaking so badly that the liquid sloshed over the rim. "Mom, we can't let this go," Ethan said. His voice was sharp and steady, cutting through the dead air in the room. Claire's gaze lifted toward him, heavy with exhaustion. "What can we do?" she whispered. "He's already sentenced." Ethan's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists on the counter. He could feel the rage simmering beneath his skin, a steady burn that had been growing ever since that night at the diner. He had the truth now, the proof. He wasn't going to let it sit in the dark. "No." His voice was sharp, final. "I'm going to expose them." Claire's shoulders sagged. She set the mug down and rubbed her eyes with trembling fingers. "Ethan? No." His voice cut through her protest like a knife. He pushed away from the counter and stalked toward the living room, yanking open the battered leather backpack sitting by the couch. He pulled out a thick, overstuffed file, pages sticking out from the edges, clipped together with metal fasteners. It was a mess of evidence. Bank statements, flight logs, offshore account details, and internal documents. The kind of evidence that ruined careers. The kind of evidence that sent men like Judge Blackwell to prison. It had taken weeks to put together. Ethan had spent hours scouring the Public Records Office, digging through tax filings and property deeds. He had hacked into business directories and reverse-engineered shell corporation ownership structures. He had traced wire transfers, small strategic amounts filtering from Senator Keaton's campaign fund into offshore accounts tied to a network of holding companies. Each account eventually funneled into one place, Judge Blackwell's private account. The meetings were confirmed on flight logs. Keaton and Blackwell had met privately on 3 separate occasions in the months leading up to Daniel's arrest. Keaton had pushed for the new zoning proposal. Daniel had opposed it at the school board meetings, arguing that it would gut local funding for low-income families. Blackwell had sentenced Daniel to clear the path for Keaton's plan. $50,000, the price of Daniel Miller's life. Ethan had it all, every piece of it. Proof. He shoved the file toward his mother. "This is real," he said, his voice burning with urgency. "This isn't speculation. This is hard evidence." Claire stared at the file like it was a bomb. "Ethan." "I'm not asking for permission," he said coldly. "I'm doing this." She reached for him, but Ethan pulled away. His heart hammered in his chest as he grabbed the file and stormed toward the front door. "Where are you going?" Claire's voice broke. Ethan turned at the threshold. "To end this." The courthouse loomed ahead, gray and cold beneath an overcast sky. Ethan's breath curled into thin white clouds as he walked toward the steps. His hands were tight around the file, his knuckles white. His heart slammed against his ribs. His palms were damp. Every muscle in his body was strung so tight he thought he might shatter. He pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the marble lobby. Courtroom 2B. He knew the schedule. He had memorized the docket. Judge Blackwell was hearing a fraud case that morning, a small procedural trial. Ethan walked through the corridor, passing rows of polished wooden benches. His eyes burned beneath the harsh overhead lights. He heard the judge's voice through the heavy oak doors before he saw him, that same cold, lifeless tone. The sound of it made Ethan's teeth grind. He shoved the door open. "Your Honor!" Ethan's voice shot through the courtroom like a bullet. The room went still. All eyes turned toward him. Blackwell's head snapped up from the bench. His mouth tightened into a thin line. "Ethan Miller?" His voice was sharp, cutting. "What is the meaning of this?" Ethan marched down the center aisle, his steps hard against the polished floor. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him. The guards shifting near the doors, the rustle of people turning toward each other in confusion. He reached the bench, set the file down hard enough to make the wood creak, and shoved it toward the judge. "This is the truth," Ethan said, his voice sharp and steady. His hands were shaking. "You took a bribe. My father is innocent." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs broke out in the gallery. The prosecutor, a tall, gray-suited man, leaned forward, his brow furrowing. Blackwell's face darkened. "Order!" His voice lashed through the noise like a whip. "Security! Remove!" The prosecutor picked up the file, flipping through the pages. His expression tightened as he scanned the documents, his mouth parted slightly. "Your Honor." His voice was thin. This is legitimate." Blackwell's mouth tightened. "That's impossible." "No," Ethan said, stepping forward. His hands curled into fists. "It's all there. The wire transfers, the meetings, the offshore accounts. My father didn't steal that money. You framed him." "You have no idea what you're talking about." Ethan's voice sharpened. "You took $50,000 from Senator Keaton to put my father away." A low rumble of shock passed through the courtroom. The prosecutor's face paled. The clerk leaned toward the file, eyes wide. Blackwell stood, his hands curling over the edge of the bench. His face was stone white beneath the overhead lights. This is outrageous. You're not getting away with it." Ethan's voice was cold and even. "Everyone knows now." Blackwell's gaze sharpened into something lethal. "You think this will change anything?" "You're finished," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "And my father is coming home." Blackwell's hand trembled as he reached for the gavel, but the prosecutor's voice cut through the air before he could speak. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, slowly, carefully, "I believe this warrants an immediate investigation." Blackwell's face froze. His eyes darkened. Ethan's chest rose and fell. His breath was sharp and uneven, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He could feel the weight of the room shifting, the tide turning. People were sitting forward in their seats, wide-eyed. Blackwell's control was slipping. Ethan didn't move. He stood with his shoulders back, his head high. His heart hammered painfully in his chest. His hands were shaking, but his eyes didn't waver from the judge's pale face. "You framed my dad," Ethan said quietly. His voice was steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And now everyone knows it." Blackwell's jaw clenched. His knuckles whitened as his hand tightened around the edge of the bench. His eyes were cold and dark, but beneath them, Ethan saw the first flicker of fear. For the first time, Judge Blackwell was no longer in control. Ethan stepped back. His breath curled in the air. He turned toward the gallery, toward the flashing of cameras and the low hum of voices rising. He had done it. He had torn the mask off the man who had destroyed his family, and it was only the beginning. The courtroom erupted the moment Ethan's words hit the air. Gasps, sharp whispers, and the frantic clicking of cameras exploded through the room as the weight of his accusation settled like a lead weight over the gathered crowd. The prosecutor stood frozen at the bench, the file still open in his hands. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and cold calculation as his eyes flicked from the file to Ethan to Judge Blackwell, whose face had turned a shade of gray so pale he almost looked sick. "Order!" Blackwell's voice lashed through the room like a whip. But it was already too late. The room was spiraling out of his control. Security moved toward Ethan. He felt the rough grip of a hand closing around his arm. "You need to leave," one of the guards growled, already steering him toward the door. Ethan didn't resist. He had done what he came to do. His heart hammered painfully in his chest, his breath sharp and shallow, but his face was steady. His eyes remained locked on Judge Blackwell as he was pulled toward the door. The judge's jaw was tight, his eyes narrow slits of cold fury. But beneath that carefully constructed mask, Ethan saw the truth. Fear. Ethan's mouth curled into a thin smile. He's scared. As he was pulled through the heavy oak doors, the courtroom erupted behind him. The low murmurs turned into frantic noise, people rising from their seats, reporters grabbing at phones and notepads. A woman's sharp voice carried over the noise. "Does this mean Daniel Miller's conviction is invalid?" The sound of Blackwell's gavel slamming against the wood was lost beneath the growing chaos. Ethan's feet barely touched the marble floor as he was marched down the hallway. Reporters were already swarming the corridor. Bright flashes from camera lights blinded him as microphones were shoved toward his face. "Ethan, did you know about the bribe? How did you uncover the evidence? What happens to Judge Blackwell now? Is Daniel Miller getting released?" Ethan's lips curled into a tight smile. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The truth was already out there, unraveling like a thread pulled from a tightly wound rope. By the time he stepped outside the courthouse, the media storm had fully ignited. A wall of reporters crowded the steps, flashes erupting from the sea of cameras. Ethan's name was already trending online. He could feel it in the frantic energy of the crowd, the urgency in their voices. But Ethan didn't stop. He walked straight through the chaos, shoulders back, head high. His hands were still trembling from the adrenaline, but he forced them to stay steady at his sides. He had done it. The first crack in Blackwell's armor had been struck, and now the whole system was starting to crumble. 3 days later, the fallout began. The prosecutor's office announced a formal investigation into Judge Blackwell's conduct. A subpoena was issued for his financial records. Anonymous sources within the courthouse leaked details to the press. Suspicious offshore transfers, cash deposits, irregularities in trial outcomes. The pieces were lining up exactly how Ethan had seen them in the files. News outlets seized on the scandal. Phrases like judicial corruption and bribery ring were plastered across headlines. Local channels ran continuous coverage, cutting between shots of the courthouse and grainy photos of Blackwell with Senator Keaton at fundraisers. The town of Fairview, which had been so quick to turn on the Millers, now found itself at the center of a national scandal. Ethan sat in the living room, watching the news cycle unfold on the muted television screen. His mother sat nearby, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked better, more color in her cheeks, her eyes brighter. Hope was creeping back into her face, filling in the hollow spaces grief had left behind. Ethan watched as Judge Blackwell's face filled the screen, his expression stoic as cameras followed him down the steps of the courthouse. The headline below read, Judge Warren Blackwell under investigation for corruption. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. 5 days after the trial, Ethan stood outside the courthouse as Blackwell was led out in handcuffs. The crowd was enormous. Reporters lined the steps, their microphones raised like weapons. Police officers flanked Blackwell on either side, their grips tight around his arms. His suit jacket was slightly rumpled, his hair disheveled. His face was drawn and gray. The cameras exploded with flashes. Shouted questions overlapped each other. "Judge Blackwell, did you accept the bribe? Was Senator Keaton involved? Did you knowingly frame Daniel Miller?" Blackwell's face was stone. He didn't speak, but Ethan saw the way his eyes darted toward the crowd, his mouth tightening. He was crumbling beneath the weight of it. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed over his chest. His gaze burned into Blackwell's face as the judge was forced into the back of a police cruiser. Blackwell's eyes flicked toward him for a single moment. Ethan didn't blink. His expression was cold and sharp. He wanted Blackwell to see him, to know that it was him who had pulled the thread, him who had exposed the truth. The door of the cruiser slammed shut. The car pulled away. Ethan exhaled slowly. His hands relaxed at his sides. It was over. 2 weeks later, Ethan stood outside the gates of Fairview State Prison. The gate buzzed open. Daniel Miller stepped into the sunlight. He looked thinner, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes were bright. His breath hitched when he saw Ethan. Ethan didn't wait. He ran forward and threw his arms around his father. Daniel's arms came up around him, pulling him in tightly. "I knew you didn't do it," Ethan whispered against his shoulder. Daniel's breath was shaky as his hand curled into the back of Ethan's jacket. "I don't know how you did it, son." His voice cracked. "But you saved me." Ethan pulled back, his hands still locked on his father's shoulders. Daniel's gaze was filled with quiet wonder, like he couldn't quite believe it was real. "Come on," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Let's go home." They walked through the gates together. The crowd beyond the fence was already gathering. Reporters with cameras and microphones, townspeople standing uncertainly at the edges of the sidewalk. And then the whispers began. "Did you hear? It wasn't Daniel. It was Blackwell. They framed him. Ethan exposed it. The Millers were innocent all along." For the first time in months, Ethan didn't feel the weight of those whispers pressing down on his chest. He stood tall beside his father, his head held high as they walked toward the waiting car. "You did it," Daniel said quietly as they climbed into the back seat. His hand settled over Ethan's wrist. "You fought for the truth." Ethan's gaze drifted toward the courthouse in the distance. His chest rose and fell steadily. The fight wasn't over yet. There would be trials, fallout, more names to expose. But the tide had turned, and Ethan Miller wasn't afraid of the fight anymore. He had already won the first battle. Now, he was ready for the war. Senator Keaton denied everything. He stood at a podium in front of a row of reporters, dressed in his usual tailored navy blue suit, his silver tie knotted perfectly beneath his collar. The cameras flashed as he raised his hands in that familiar, polished gesture of calm reassurance. "I had no knowledge of any financial misconduct involving Judge Blackwell," he said, his voice smooth and carefully measured. "The accusations against me are baseless and politically motivated." He smiled faintly, his eyes calm, controlled. But the evidence was already public. The transfers from his fund to Blackwell's offshore accounts had been traced, documented, verified. The shell companies tied to Keaton's campaign were unraveling under federal investigation. Flight logs confirmed the private meetings with Blackwell. Multiple witnesses, including 2 of Keaton's former aides, had already turned over sworn statements. The press conference ended in chaos. Reporters shouted over each other, microphones jabbing toward Keaton's face as he retreated behind his security detail. The headlines followed the next morning. Senator Keaton linked to judicial corruption scandal. Blackwell trial exposes political collusion at the highest level. The fall of a powerhouse. What's next for Senator Keaton? The weight of the scandal crushed him. His campaign donors pulled their support. His political allies distanced themselves. Invitations to high-profile events evaporated overnight. The committee he once chaired issued a formal censure. An ethics investigation followed, and Keaton's legal team began preparing for what most analysts predicted would be a lengthy and humiliating criminal trial. Keaton's face, once a symbol of power and control, now carried a different meaning. He was no longer the kingmaker of Fairview. He was the disgraced politician who had tried to destroy an innocent man's life to push through his zoning proposal, and lost. Ethan watched it all unfold from a distance. People called him a hero. His face was on the front page of the Fairview Gazette. A local radio station tried to interview him. They wanted to know how a 15-year-old boy had single-handedly exposed the deepest political scandal in the town's history. Ethan refused to answer. At school, things were different now. His classmates whispered when he walked through the halls, but not with the same quiet malice as before. This time, their eyes were wide with something else: respect, awe. Tyler, the same friend who had turned his back on Ethan after the trial, walked up to him in the cafeteria one afternoon and mumbled an awkward, "Hey, man, you want to sit with us?" Ethan shook his head. He wasn't angry anymore, but he wasn't interested either. Teachers, too, began to treat him differently. Mrs. Hartman, who hadn't called on him once since his father's arrest, suddenly started smiling at him in class. Mr. Conway, his history teacher, pulled him aside after class one afternoon. "You stood up for what was right," he said, his voice low. "Most adults wouldn't have had the guts to do what you did." Ethan nodded, but the words didn't sink in the way they should have. He hadn't done it for praise. He hadn't done it for the town. He had done it for his father, and because the truth deserved to be known. And now it was. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch steps, his knees pulled up to his chest. The air was cool, the evening sky streaked with pale orange light. The street was quiet, except for the sound of cicadas buzzing from the tall grass near the sidewalk. The screen door creaked open. Daniel stepped outside, easing down onto the step beside Ethan. He was still thin from the months in prison, but the color had returned to his face. His eyes were brighter. His shoulders had straightened again. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "I'm proud of you," Daniel said finally, his voice soft but steady. Ethan's gaze stayed fixed on the street in front of them. He felt his father's hand settle lightly on his shoulder. Ethan hesitated. His throat felt tight. "I couldn't let them win." His father's hand tightened. "You didn't." Ethan turned toward him. "But they will try again, won't they? There's always going to be someone like Blackwell, someone like Keaton." Daniel's eyes darkened slightly. He nodded. "Probably." Ethan's mouth tightened. His hands curled into fists over his knees. "Then what's the point?" Daniel smiled faintly. "The point is that this time they didn't win." Ethan's breath hitched. He looked down at his hands, his chest tightening. "Dad, I didn't know if it would work, if they'd believe me." Daniel's hand slid from his shoulder to the back of his neck. "You didn't let that stop you." A breeze cut through the porch, stirring the loose gravel beneath their feet. Ethan watched a single leaf flutter down from the maple tree in the front yard. His father's presence beside him was solid, grounding, but Ethan could still feel the sharp edge of what they had survived. "I didn't save the town," Ethan said. Daniel shook his head. "No." His gaze sharpened. "But you changed it." Ethan's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Daniel's expression softened. People saw what you did. You stood up for the truth when no one else would. The town turned its back on us. But you didn't give up. That matters. Ethan shook his head. They hated us. They believed the worst about you. And now they know the truth. Ethan's chest tightened. The truth. That's what mattered. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about seeing Blackwell in cuffs or watching Keaton's empire burn. It was about knowing that the truth, once exposed, couldn't be buried again. Daniel's gaze softened. Ethan. Ethan looked at his father. You didn't just save me. Daniel's voice was quiet but sharp with meaning. You reminded this town that the truth matters, that it's worth fighting for. Ethan's throat tightened. He ducked his head. Yeah, maybe. Daniel's arm slid across Ethan's shoulders. You're stronger than you know. They sat together in silence, watching the last of the sunlight fade beneath the tree line. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed shut. A neighbor's dog barked. The world was still turning. Life was moving forward. And for the first time in months, Ethan wasn't afraid of what came next. The truth was out now. It couldn't be undone. Judge Blackwell's reputation was ruined. Senator Keaton's political career was on the verge of collapse. But more importantly, Daniel Miller was free. His name had been cleared. And Ethan had done it. He had forced the world to face the truth, no matter how hard they had tried to bury it. Ethan leaned back against his father's shoulder, his eyes fixed on the quiet street ahead. Justice had been served. But the real victory wasn't in seeing Judge Blackwell go to jail. It wasn't even in seeing Keaton's career collapse. The real victory was knowing that no matter how deep the lies went, the truth had survived, and Ethan Miller had made sure of that. Months passed. The world didn't change overnight, but piece by piece, the edges started to smooth out. Ethan walked through the halls of Fairview High School, and this time the whispers were gone. The stares had faded. The side glances, the hushed conversations behind locker doors, all of it had dissolved into a quiet stillness. Now, when people saw Ethan, they didn't see the son of a criminal. They saw something else: respect. It was in the way Tyler stopped him in the hallway one afternoon, running a hand awkwardly through his hair. Hey, you want to hang out this weekend? It was in the way Mrs. Hartman smiled when he raised his hand in class, in the way Mr. Conway gave him a quiet nod after history, lingering a moment too long before walking away. It was in the way people didn't avoid his eyes anymore. Ethan didn't know how to feel about it at first. For months he had been defined by his father's conviction, by the whispers, the suspicion, the quiet hostility that followed him wherever he went. He had learned how to navigate the weight of that judgment, how to exist beneath the surface of people's contempt. Now that it was gone, The empty space it left behind felt strange, but not unwelcome. Ethan adjusted. Slowly, carefully. He walked down the hallways with his head held high, not because he wanted attention, but because he had earned the right to. He wasn't looking for approval anymore. He didn't need it. But still, it was nice to know that people finally saw the truth. The truth. That was what mattered. It wasn't about Blackwell's downfall, or Keaton's ruined career, or the headlines that had blazed through the local news cycle for weeks after the trial. It wasn't even about the way people in town had started talking about the Millers again, with curiosity instead of contempt. It was about knowing that he had done something, that he had fought for what was right, and won. It was a warm evening when Ethan sat alone on the school steps, his elbows resting on his knees. The sun was low on the horizon, bleeding shades of orange and pink into the thin cloud cover. The coolness of the concrete beneath him seeped through his jeans, grounding him. The sounds of the town drifted lazily through the air. Distant traffic, the chirp of crickets in the grass beyond the football field, the occasional burst of laughter from a passing group of kids. Ethan closed his eyes and let his breath settle. His chest rose and fell slowly. His hands relaxed over his knees. For the first time in months, he wasn't tense. He wasn't on edge, waiting for the next blow to land. His body wasn't preparing to fight or flee. He was just still. The screen door of the school creaked open behind him. Heavy footsteps echoed across the pavement, followed by the familiar sound of a deep, steady breath. Daniel sat down beside him on the steps. His father's presence was solid and grounding. Daniel stretched his legs out in front of him, his hands resting on his knees. He was wearing a plain t-shirt and a pair of faded jeans, his shoes scuffed at the edges. His hair was a little longer now, curling slightly at his temples. He looked healthier, stronger, like the weight of prison had finally lifted from his shoulders. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun slide lower behind the treetops. The shadows stretched long across the pavement, the sky turning darker at the edges. Daniel's voice was low when he finally spoke. "Life's not always fair." Ethan's gaze remained on the horizon. He breathed in the cool evening air, felt the last warmth of the sun on his face. "Yeah, but you proved that sometimes justice wins." Ethan's chest tightened. He turned his head toward his father. Daniel's face was calm, his eyes bright with quiet pride. Ethan smiled faintly. "Because sometimes you have to stand up, no matter what." Daniel's hand settled lightly on his shoulder. His grip was steady, solid. The weight of it didn't feel like a burden anymore. "You didn't just stand up," Daniel said. "You stood alone, and you didn't back down." Ethan's throat tightened. He lowered his head, his eyes burning. "I didn't know if it would work," he admitted quietly. Daniel's smile softened. "But you did it anyway." Ethan's fingers curled over the edge of the step. His father's hand didn't move from his shoulder. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the silence between them. "It shouldn't have been you," Daniel said after a long moment. His voice was rough at the edges. "It shouldn't have been on you to fix it." Ethan shook his head. "It doesn't matter." "It does." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You were 15 and you had to fight harder than most adults ever will." Ethan swallowed hard. "I couldn't let them win." Daniel nodded. "No, you couldn't." The sun sank beneath the tree line. The sky bled into shades of deep purple and navy blue. Daniel's hand fell away from Ethan's shoulder, but his presence remained steady beside him. They sat together in the darkening twilight, breathing in the cool night air. "I don't think they'll forget what you did," Daniel said quietly. "Not the town, not Blackwell, not Keaton." Ethan smiled faintly. "Good." Daniel's brow lifted. You're not scared of them anymore, are you? Ethan shook his head. No. Daniel's smile widened slightly. Good. The streetlights buzzed to life down the block, casting a pale glow over the pavement. Daniel shifted to his feet, brushing the dust off his jeans. You coming? Ethan hesitated. He looked out over the darkened street, over the empty football field and the line of maple trees beyond it. The town lay quiet beneath the gathering night. I think I'll stay a little longer. Daniel nodded. All right. Just don't stay out too late. Ethan smiled. Yeah. His father turned and started down the sidewalk. Ethan watched him go, his shadow stretching long beneath the streetlights. Daniel's figure grew smaller as he reached the corner, then disappeared around the bend. Ethan leaned back against the step, closing his eyes. The cool breeze stirred his hair. His heart was calm. His mind was quiet. The truth was out there now. It had cut through the lies and darkness, exposing everything Judge Blackwell and Senator Keaton had tried to bury. They had tried to ruin his father's life, and they had almost succeeded. But Ethan had stopped them. He had pulled the truth into the light. And no one, not even the most powerful men in Fairview, could take that away from him. For the first time since the nightmare began, Ethan felt peace. Not because the town had changed, not because Blackwell was in prison or Keaton's career was over, because Ethan had fought for the truth and won. And now, finally, he could breathe.